Okay, thank you, Professor. Thank you, May, for setting up the stage for my presentation. So today I'll be presenting the work that I presented last November in the ARMA DGS SEG International Geomechanics Symposium with a few more improvements from November. And yeah, so today I'll be talking about the geomechanical analysis of the fracture morphologies that we've received from a laboratory hydraulic fracture experiment on Montney shale. So my colleague May has previously discussed this experiment, but I'll reiterate it to provide the relevant details to set up the stage for my work. So in our lab, we performed a true-triaxial fracturing experiment on Montney shale that we recovered from reservoir depth. And as shown here, we've constructed an injection hole along the sigma 3 direction here. And the bedding planes were also oriented about 20 degrees off parallel to the sigma 3 axis. And the stress state was also such that the sigma 1 was oriented horizontally. Hydraulic fracturing was simulated by injecting water through an injection borehole at a constant rate. And fluid pressure was monitored at the borehole throughout the test, and it provides an approximation of the fluid pressure experienced inside the sample. So this experiment provided mechanical data that showed interesting insights into the hydraulic fracturing experience, the hydraulic fracturing process, but there's still quite a wealth of information to recover from the sample itself. So as my colleague May had mentioned, after the sample was recovered, we injected and stabilized it with an ultraviolet fluorescent epoxy, both from within the borehole and from the outer faces. And then we used a digital camera, ultraviolet light, and a CNC grinder to obtain consecutive sections of the sample. And this provided an image stack of the fracture network within the sample. So this technique is called serial sectioning. And this is a technique similar to what is done in medicine biology, where 3D image is reconstructed from sectioned specimens. And this allows us to preserve the fracture network shape and also produces a high resolution image that are better than the ones that we are currently able to produce with X-ray CT imaging for samples of this size, which is about 8 centimeters in length. So the images shown are examples of the sections taken from the top, middle, and bottom of the sample. And this resulted in a large data set with a resolution of 39 by 39 by 50 microns. So to summarize, the data that we have obtained from this experiment are the fractures mapped by serial sectioning, the stress state applied to the sample, and the injection pressures experienced during the test. With this information, we can use this to analytically estimate the fracture slip within the sample by using the fracture network and morphology to determine the mechanical behaviors of each individual fracture. So to do this, the following steps are undertaken. First, we extract the individual fracture geometries from the fracture image stack. Then we quantify the fracture roughness to estimate its influence on fracture slip. Then we estimate the approximate fracture plane stresses acting on each individual fracture based on its orientation with respect to the applied stress state. And with this information, we can then determine the peak shear strength of each fracture and compare it against the actual applied shear stress to calculate a fracture slipping potential. So with the image stack being multicolored, first we needed to convert it into a grayscale image to segment the fracture geometries. And for this work, we've achieved it by splitting the color images into its various color channels, choosing the color channels that best contrast the fractures in the rock, filtering them by the median intensity value, and then recombining them with the minimum intensity to obtain an image of the fracture network as shown on the right. While the fractures are segmentable at this stage, there's still noise present in the images. So to remove this, a Hessian-based planar filter was used to highlight the features that were most similar to planes. So this result was then binarized to exhibit the resulting fractures. And at this point, the fractures can be represented as a point cloud. And this is useful for many different studies, such as numerical simulation or fracture aperture. However, since we just need to estimate the fracture roughness, we need the fractures to be thinned to a width of 1 voxel. So thinning of the fractures was performed so that the resultant images represent the center line of the fractures. We also needed to separate the individual fractures from the network. And this was achieved by using a neural network architecture called UNet to determine the intersection of the fractures. So this is the separation work that we did prior to what May has presented today. And this was achieved by training the model on 10 images from the image set with the intersections marked. And this produced another set of images containing the detected intersections, which we used to separate the fractures. And to do this, the intersections were subtracted from the original image, and then the fractures were separated using a connected components algorithm. And since several fractures intersected others, some fractures were expected to become fragmented with this method. So after reviewing the separated fractures, the fragments that appeared to be related were rejoined manually. So after separation, the fractures looked like this. And in addition to separating fractures, we classified the fractures on the basis that they were oriented along the bedding plane orientation, which was about 20 degrees from the horizontal. So the non-bedding fractures are shown on the right and tended to be much larger than the bedding fractures. And the non-bedding fractures, as May had mentioned, were also noticeably rougher, which I'll talk more about quantifying later. There are still some fractures that remain unseparated to this process due to some remaining pixels and undetected fracture intersections. But in the future, we'll be using the results that May had been achieving with the fracture separation. So at this point, we have the individual fractures. Now we can calculate the surface roughness of each individual fracture. So because the surfaces were generated from an image stack, they were subject to very jagged profiles due to the rigid grid structure of the images. And this is detrimental to the roughness analysis since they rely on a variation of the surface angles. So to fix this, we used a moving least squares filter that was applied to the fracture data to smooth the points. And this filter works on each data point by applying a polynomial approximation in the neighborhood of each point, and then resampling that point based on that surface that it created. So this does reduce the resolution of the image being, or of the surface being analyzed. However, we can still capture the general features from this process. So after we smooth the fractures, we mesh them using a Delaunay triangulation algorithm. And on the left, I have an example of a bedding plane fracture, about 2 centimeters in size, and a non-bedding plane fracture about 4 centimeters in size on the right. So we can immediately see the difference in roughness of these fractures in relation to each other. However, we can also quantify this using roughness analysis. So the roughness of each fracture was calculated using the directional roughness metric. And this calculates roughness in 3D along arbitrary directions in the surface being analyzed. And it does so by establishing an analysis direction and then filters out the areas facing against it. And these filtered areas are considered to be the contributors of shear stress against the analysis direction due to their orientation. Then the slopes of these areas are used to determine the directional roughness metric. And using this metric, I showed a distribution of directional roughness for bedding and non-bedding fractures on the right. And because the directional roughness metric represents a range of values, I also show the minimum, average, and maximum directional roughness. So we can see that the range of roughness is overlapping in between the two sets. However, we can see non-bedding fractures clearly show greater roughness compared to the bedding fractures. And this shows that the bedding planes opened by hydraulic fracture still remain smoother than the other fractures caused by the hydraulic fracturing. So because our test was applied under true-triaxial conditions, the applied stress state can be used to determine the plane stresses on the fractures after hydraulic fracturing. So we can determine a traction vector for each individual fracture based on applied stress state, and we then determine the normal stress and applied shear stress. And this does assume that the hydraulic fracturing process does not distort the stress state of the fracture's local area. However, this can be considered a close approximation of the stresses that the fractures may experience. And we also reduce the normal stress to the effective normal stress by subtracting the fluid pressure measured during the fracturing process. And 20 MPa was used since this was a sustained pressure after the breakdown pressure event. So now that we have the plane stresses determined, we can also determine the shearing direction, which we can use to calculate the roughness along the direction, which I denote here as the shear directional roughness. So this information can all be assembled to determine the peak shear stress failure criterion. And this is the stress at which the fracture will move. So although it assumes that the fractures are matching and have not shifted, excuse me, the tensile strength was determined from Brazilian disc tests performed at the same core. And the mesh parameter is an empirical parameter accounts for the mesh size and resolution. The area fraction was obtained from the roughness analysis, since this is the area fraction facing the shear direction. And this information provided the slipping potential, which I show here as the proportion of the applied shear stress to the peak shear stress. So with this calculation, it turns out that non-bedding fractures have a higher roughness, or that have a higher roughness are more likely to slip compared to the bedding plane fractures. And this is because their orientation is aligned with the principal stresses, or sorry, the non-bedding plane fractures are less aligned with the principal stresses compared to the bedding planes. This suggests that the stress environment can play a larger role compared to roughness. And now we can simulate lubrication along the surfaces by setting the basic friction angle to 0. And this increases the slipping potential of some of the fractures to slightly greater than 1, meaning that they will likely slip, or they will slip. So here is a schematic showing that the fractures that indicating slip in red. And there are also several fractures here with slipping potentials that show that they are also likely to slip with extra stress perturbations, and this is shown in yellow. However, this also assumes that this occurs when lubrication of the surfaces is assumed. You should also note that this analysis still assumes that the fractures were perfectly mated and do not experience local stress changes due to its environment. And a more complex simulation of the network would be required to account for these mechanics. These fractures were created using the central line of the fractures, and also does not account for the material loss in between the separated fracture surfaces. So with that, we could show that with this work, we've shown that this experiment can highlight the fractures that interact with the hydraulic fracturing process. And we can link the interactions between the fracture geometry and orientation with the surrounding stress field during hydraulic fracturing. This particular analysis showed that fracture slip is more influenced by the fracture orientation compared to roughness. And we can conclude from this that care should be taken with fractures oriented diagonal to the principal stress directions during hydraulic fracturing operations in the field. So with that, I'd like to thank NSERC-Energi Simulation, Petronas, CMG, Shawcor, and Geomechanical for their support. And I'll now open up the floor to questions. Thank you.